Hey guys, welcome back to another map of the day. And the one we're going to be looking at today is called Heartland. So basically the way the map looks is that players all start out in this valley area here, which is in the lowlands. So players have pretty sparse wood available to them surrounding their bases. And in the middle of the valley is this pretty narrow lake, which players can use to gain an economy advantage early on. And then on the sides, we have the elevated terrain where the majority of the extra wood is, and even though it's elevated, there's still enough flat area to be able to sustain some economy in the late game. So that's basically the way the map looks, and we're going to be focusing on how to create this map. So let's get started. So here we are taking a look at this map in the editor. And what we can notice from this is that the players are in an elliptical orientation, so to speak. So these elliptical orientations are pretty useful in the sense that it allows us to have interesting things going on the sides and or the middle of the map, for example, the lake and the mountain area here, while still not crowding the players so much compared to if, for example, this mountainous area were to encompass all the edges of the map as opposed to just two of them. So the concept of this map is not exactly complicated. So when I usually go through maps, I usually try to take the simplest approach first because it's going to take the least amount of work to maintain in the future. So that's what I'll start out with, and we can take that as far as we can until that starts to fall apart and we start to need to bring in more advanced methods. So let's go to a test script, and then the first approach we'll just do with random placement and see where that takes us. And then in our land generation section, we want the base terrain of the map to be whatever these mountainous areas are going to be. And I'm going to make that base terrain of road 2, and we'll see why in a minute. So the next thing we'll do is create player lands, and so these are going to be the player lands that is going to represent the valley. So it's going to have unconstrained top and bottom borders, and we'll have some borders on the left and right hand side to create the valley. So we'll have this terrain type be grass jungle, and this constant is, I think, 50. We'll see if we're right. And then land percent 100 base size 11. We'll have our top, well, we'll have our right and left borders be 18, and we'll give it some border fuzziness also of 7, and then we'll see what that does for us in the test map. So it's actually not 50, it's 60. So now that we have that, we'll concentrate next on making the mountains on the sides. So I use this road just as a placeholder, and we're going to create elevation on top of that. So we'll create elevation 3. Base terrain will be road 2. Number of tiles will be very many. Number of clumps will also be very many. So that'll be the first thing we do to elevate the road that much. And then what we'll do is we'll then elevate it from 3 all the way to 7 but we'll do that gradually. So we'll give it a spacing attribute of 8. So now we can see the initial step of elevation is quite steep, but then after that it elevates very gradually until we get to the edge of the map here. So now we want to convert this into ground terrain, so we will go into the terrain generation section. Make that savanna. Base terrain. Road 2. Land percent 100. Number of clumps. Very many. Set scale by groups. And we only want the flat portions of this terrain to be covered in savanna grass. So we will set flat terrain only, and when we use that attribute we also must have a spacing to other terrain types attribute of at least 1, and then we've taken care of that. And then what I want to do next is I want to create one strip of rock terrain, which is in between these steps of elevation. So it's between the road. So I will, instead of creating savanna, I'll create DLC rock, which is also going to be on road 2. I don't want it to set flat terrain only, but I do want it to avoid the savanna by a certain amount so that it'll go right in the middle of this road. So it stays one tile away from the savanna and only on this elevated portion here. So now that that's done, I can replace the rest of the road with the savanna grass. So that's going to be the same thing, except we're not going to set flat terrain only, and we're not going to include that spacing to other terrain types. So we still have some residual terrain left over, so we'll just copy these statements one more time just for good measure. So that's looking a bit better. And then finally, whichever savanna grass is still left at elevation 0, we will replace that with that jungle grass. So we will replace the savanna with grass jungle, and that's going to have height limits of 0. So that takes care of that. And now our mountainy area is pretty much done. Of course we can clean it up later and add the trees later on, but that's basically the gist of how it works. So the next thing we're going to focus on is how to create potentially the narrow lake that's going to be in the middle of the map. So let's try to create a neutral land that's going to represent the lake. So back in the land generation section, we'll make a statement that says create land. We'll have it shallow, and it'll take up all the land that we allow in its borders, and we'll make the borders top border, we'll call it 15. We'll make the right and left borders much larger, so we'll have this be 45, and then the left border will be also 45. And then for good measure, we'll put it right in the middle. And let's see what this does. So it's supposed to create the top and bottom border, which would end about approximately there and there. And the right and left borders are quite high, so it would end fairly close to the middle of the map, about here and here. So we can see it generates something for us, but not very much. It doesn't quite take up all of the area that we'd want it to. And if a player happened to randomly spawn at the top of the map, in this situation he would have very poor access to the water compared to a player spawning here. So we have a real issue with consistency here, and that is due to the fact that we have already specified the player lands to take up 100% of this area. So now that we're trying to cram this much in, it's not finding room for it. Now, it's important to know that when you're working with random placement, is that the player lands always have a tendency to take priority over neutral lands in terms of taking up space. So let's just say, for example, that instead of player lands, we'll just keep these over here for later, comment them out, we had just a generic neutral land that would take up the same amount of space. So it would have the same attributes, and we'll just put that land position at 51, so that its origin would be approximately right here. So now we can see that the land that's supposed to be representing the lake is a bit more consistent now that we have generated the valley area as a neutral land instead of player lands. You can still lose some of its area since the origin of that first land is at the top here, but it's still a bit more consistent than what we saw in the previous iteration. And now if we uncomment the player lands and say, instead of taking up all the area, take up no area, we can see a much more consistent lake compared to when we had the player land set at 100%. So it's still not perfect, but let's just say, for example, that we decided to keep it this way. Let's try and think about the implications that this could have later on in the script by having a neutral land generated in this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an object section in the map. And then eventually we're going to have to create some gold piles for our players. So let's do that right now. So we'll create object. We'll just make it a lot for now. This is trying to show my point. I'm going to set place for every player, and then min distance to players attribute of 15. So we'll have to set guy object only. So we can see that we've covered our map in very many gold piles, and we can kind of see where they could potentially spawn based on the squares it drew around the player origins. So we can see 8 origins here because there are 8 players in the game. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. But if we keep generating, we can also see that in addition to those 8 player lands, we have this area over here, which is about where we put that neutral land up at the top. See, that location was at 51, and that's basically where this is here. So what exactly is going on here? So basically, if we could divide objects into 2 categories, those categories would be generically placed objects and origin referenced objects. So basically, generically placed objects have no reference to any origin, and origin referenced objects are referenced to an origin. For example, set place to every player references the gold piles to the player origin, and then the other origin referencing attribute is place on specific land ID. So these 2 attributes would make an object origin referenced. And when we are dealing with origin referenced objects, this attribute min distance to players will keep these objects from from spawning too close to any land origin, not just the one it's referenced to. So just by having this neutral land here, we are inadvertently affecting the placement of gold piles. So if a player happens to spawn at the top of the map here, it's pretty much guaranteed that he's never going to have his gold pile in the back of the map because of this neutral land keeping all objects away from that by a certain amount. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that issue may seem pretty minor, but it's always something we have to be conscious of, is that whenever we have a neutral land that's going to be spawning in close proximity to a player, it can affect the way that player's resources are generated by keeping objects away from it. So even though we were able to achieve some degree of consistency with this lake in the middle, it's really not an ideal solution, so we'll backtrack a bit. We will get rid of these gold piles first, and then we'll reset the player lands to be 100% so we no longer have that neutral land in. So instead of creating this middle lake as just a single land, we're going to try a bit more of a brute force method. So this is Madlands, in case you didn't know that already. And so what we're going to do here is, instead of creating one land, we're going to create a land pattern based on these parameters. So the base radius is going to be 30, and then it's going to be compressed to an x stretch of 0.25, which is going to make it look like this. So since our angle increment is 3, that's going to give us 90 total lands, and this is actually supposed to say terrain type. So if we replace that single neutral land with this land pattern, let's see what that does for us here. So we have the outline all good for us, but now let us fill in the middle here by needing one more land at position 50-50, and we'll get rid of these attributes because we want it to take up all of the area. So we can see what it does here is it creates a very nice and consistent land for us here, except for this little patch here. Now let's try and figure out why that's happening. We can see that even though sometimes it's bigger than others, we can only see whenever it does happen, it happens on the bottom side of this lake, so to speak, instead of the top. So let's try and figure out what's going on. So what I'm going to do is, in the object section, I'm going to create object town center. Set place for every player, and then max distance to players is going to be 0. So that's just going to indicate where each player is starting, and let's see what we can find. So we can see that in this case there's no little patch in this lake here, but if we keep generating, we can see that anytime we have a player that's going to be spawning whether close or even inside this lake, we'll have this kind of thing happening. And if we keep on generating, we can see that it only ever happens on the bottom side, because in this case, players are able to spawn so far away from the edge of the map to encroach onto this lake area. And we can see that's never the case in the top. These lands at the top are always going to spawn fairly close to the top border of the map. That's kind of a phenomenon that exists when we have uneven borders for player lands, that there will always be some bias that keeps the players from spawning too close to the bottom edge of the map. And that's just inherently coming from random placement. Even though there's a lot of empty space towards the bottom of the map that we would prefer the players to spawn in, it simply won't do it, no matter how many times we generate this. So, instead of using random placement, we're going to have to figure out something else we could possibly do. So here we are back in Madlands, and the reason we're here is because we are going to try a direct placement approach to set up the player lands. So we can use many of the same attributes that we used when we were doing the lands with random placement. So we'll just take these, copy them over, and then we'll put them in here. So we have our terrain type as the jungle grass. We have it still taking up all of the land. Base size is 11. The borders will be the same. And the border fuzziness will be the same also. So we'll make sure we have a leaving space. And then we'll start everything at 0 degrees. And we'll set the base radius to 40. And we'll compress the lands in the x direction by a factor of 0.6. So that'll make it elliptical, as we can see here. And then let's just let's rotate it slightly a little. So now if we copy this, replace the player lands, and then importantly we have to switch from random placement to direct placement. Let's see what that does for us here. So we can see that in contrast to the previous method we tried, since we are placing our lands very precisely, we can utilize the map's area a bit better, and we can avoid having the bias that would come with random placement, and we are now able to spawn lands much closer to the bottom of the map compared to what we were using in the previous version. As we can see, the player positions are very rigid at the moment. If we keep generating, they'll always end up in the same positions, not necessarily in the same assignments. And we can add some randomness back in later, but first let's work on the terrain section a bit more. So I'm just going to copy some of the terrains from the official map because they're not really super special. So first we're going to fill some of the water inside the shallow area here. So that's what that does. And then we have the forest that's going to be in close proximity with the players. So it's going to be 3% overall. We can see those over here. And then after that, we're going to create some shallow patches around. So notice how we are first creating these as patches of dirt. And the reason for that is when we have this attribute spacing to other terrain types, if the terrain was shallow at first, the spacing to other terrain types would not avoid these shallows here. So that's why we are first making these terrains as dirt so that they will avoid the shallows here, and then we can cover them up with shallows afterward. So that's what that does. I also want to point out that in order to get the Acacia Forest to blend in pretty seamlessly with the grass that's its base terrain, so we can see where we're using a terrain mask here. So the terrain mask value is 2, which means that we're taking the properties of the Acacia Forest, and that's why the trees are able to spawn. And in contrast, if we, for example, had a Acacia Forest with the terrain mask value of 1 instead of 2, then the terrain would take the properties of grass jungle, and as we can see what this does here, it's creating these patches of terrain without creating any trees. So that's just for an aesthetic effect, and it doesn't actually create trees. And then the next thing we're going to do is create some Acacia Forest on the mountainy area here, which is on the savanna. Terrain mask is 2, so that the trees will, of course, appear. So we have these trees up here. And then finally, we're going to have some of the jungle grass layered on top of the savanna on the top here for a nice aesthetic effect there also. And that about does it for the terrains. And then next we have the objects generation section, which again is not super special. It's basically the way you would generate objects here is the way you generate objects in any other map. So we'll just paste it all in and just briefly go through it. So we have standard player objects here. We have 3 villagers and the scout. We have the straggler trees, and we have a total of 6 buffaloes per player. And then we have 2 rhinos, one here, a patch of 4 zebras, and we have some player gold as well as some extra gold that can spawn either in the mountainy area or some can potentially spawn in the valley also. We have some fish in the middle, and yeah, that about does it for the objects. And now, I said before that since the player positions are still very rigid here, we can start to add some randomness back in now that the rest of the map is taken care of. So, as we should know already, that the Madlands utility has this land randomizer feature. So what we can do here, I will choose to go with location translation. I will have an angle increment of 30 with 12 configurations. I'll include all 8 lands and include random yes. And for good measure, I will include team positions also. So we'll use the default team positions and we'll just say that's 8 player for now. And then we'll generate that and see what it does. So it found 8 player lands, that's good. So now instead of a single configuration for the direct placement elliptical setup, we now have 12 configurations which are 30 degrees apart from each other. So we'll copy this big chunk of code here, and then we will replace the small chunk of code that we did first. And let's see what it does here. So since we generated a team position setup, we can see that the team positions box is checked, so it should be generating warm colors versus cool colors in this scenario. So we have red, yellow, purple, and orange all on the teams together, and we have blue, green, teal, and gray all on the team together, and they're occupying this sort of section of the map. And if we generate again, we can see that it's randomly choosing a different configuration, which is spawning team 1 at the bottom here and spawning team 2 at the top. Now obviously what we've just done only encompasses an 8-player team position setup. So if we want to support different configurations, for example 2-player games, 3-player games, etc., and we want to have options with team positions and options without, we'd have to do a bit more work. But for demonstrative purposes, that's all we're going to focus on now. And so now we basically have our completed map. And so just to do a small recap of what we've done. So even though the overall concept of the map wasn't super complicated, it's still important to be aware of the limitations of the RMS engine, specifically with limitations with random placement, so we can be aware of those limitations and know when to implement some more advanced methods. So I think that's about all I wanted to talk about in this video. So as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you've learned something.